This is Sky News at 9. You're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making tomorrow's headlines with media commentator Vince Graff and journalist Nabila Ramdani. Very good evening to you both. First, though, a reminder of tonight's top stories. Police in Northern Ireland have arrested a man on suspicion of attempted murder following violent clashes between loyalists and nationalists. David Cameron has said that he hopes to serve as Prime Minister until at least 2020. His comments in an interview with the Sunday Telegraph come as he prepares for the coalition's New Year relaunch. Labour is calling for tougher limits on levels of sugar, salt and fat in children's food. The government says Britain's high childhood obesity rate is a legacy of the last Labour government. Well, that's today's news. Let's take a look at tomorrow's. Vince, Nabila, welcome again. And we're going to start with the Mail on Sunday, which has got a story about a rail minister who it says is spending $80,000 a year on a limo to work to avoid the overcrowded trains that he's responsible for. What do you make of this, Vince?
Well, I think top marks to Glenn Owen, the political correspondent, who's come up with the idea. It's a clever idea. You know, rail fares just gone up. Oh, I wonder how the rail minister goes to work. We know how the rail minister goes to work. He goes to work the same way that all ministers go to work. They have government cars. And I think it's right they have government cars. I think it's bad that that train line is overcrowded, but I don't want someone I'm paying to help make decisions on government policy to waste the time into work because he's cramped up against someone else's armpit and therefore not in a position to... I want him working on the way there. I want to get good value out of Simon Burns. The thing that shocks me about this story isn't that he gets a government car into work, it's that it costs 80 grand. The Mail on Sunday has done a sum at the bottom. It says they've worked it out at £400 a day. I think if you allow him a bit of holiday, assuming he doesn't go in every day of the year, it might even be a little bit more than that. But I mean, it's the government contract that means that a car, I suppose, you know, you've got a driver and I mean, how much are they going to pay that driver? Nothing close to that. I mean, that's the thing I find baffling is, and worrying is that it costs so much.
35 miles, it says, from his Essex home to his Whitehall office. Nabila, what do you think of this? A lot of people will be offended that a government minister is spending this amount of money, taxpayers' money, getting to work. But Vince doesn't think it's that bad.
But I think, as Vince said, it was an expected story. You know, we would expect a paper to look into how the rail minister goes to work. But I don't think it's unreasonable to expect from a cabinet minister to actually save time by using a chauffeur to, you know, to drive him to work. You know, a lot of busy people who are not running the country use cars to be able to work while they being transported
but they pay for
effectively.
It themselves.
They pay
That's
for
the
it
difference.
themselves.
This is taxpayers' money.
Or their companies doing this is taxpayers' money. This will get people very cross, which is the kind of aim of it. But I think
when you're a very important person, I mean, I'm looking at the example in France, for example, where the socialist president has tried extremely hard to portray himself as Mr. Normal. You can't expect somebody who runs a country, who you know, is in charge of who occupies the highest function of a country, to be a normal person.
I don't even want them to be. I want them. I mean, I knew Simon Burns from years back when he was a lowly backbencher. We've kind of lost touch since. But I want.
We see government ministers cycling in.
Well, yes, you do when there are cameras watching them cycle in. You're the famous thing with the Prime Minister with the car behind.
Carrying his briefcase.
Yes, I don't want that. They're not. I mean, government ministers shouldn't be ordinary people. They should be, you know, the best of the best. And they're not in all cases. But I think it's perfectly reasonable for them to have a car that takes them in. It doesn't.
Having said that, it might trigger change in the way cabinet ministers work across Europe. I mean, if you look at Nordic countries, for example, it's very much expected for them to take buses or to commute on regular trains, and that's the normal thing to do. And if you use cars or anything that's paid for by the taxpayer, then you know you are likely to get the sack. So I don't know if it...
But I mean, I don't... In the same way, we don't have a bicycling monarchy. I think we've got it right. Like I say, I think the question this really poses is how bad are the civil service at negotiating contracts if it really does cost 80 grand a year? Because that seems like a lot of money.
Well, I expect there'll be plenty more on this. Let's take a look at another story in the front page here. Sad story, this one, but definitely worth talking about because it is such a rare condition. This is Colleen Rooney with her 14-year-old sister Rosie, who died today from this Rett syndrome. I don't know how much reading you've done into this. It's a very rare condition, apparently, a neurological condition which mainly affects girls. But the fact that it's on the front pages means people will be reading about it. It's a really horrible condition, I was reading. Affects you from the age of, pretty young age, 1, 2 years old, and affects all of your development.
I think the inside of the Mail on Sunday says that it's a condition that hits one girl in 12,000. So it's very rare indeed. And the only thing I would say is when it affects somebody that's in the public eye, like the Rooney family, and I would suggest that with the amount of money that they have, it might be an incentive to start, putting money into research to deal with that kind of condition, or
well, they may well do that, might they? We don't know.
And it will increase, obviously, public awareness of the condition, though I'm sure that's the last thing on her mind right at this terrible moment. I mean, it's an awful thing to happen.
Let's take a look at the other front page story here in the Mail on Sunday. UKIP surge. Highest poll rating ever. Record support for the anti-Brussels UKIP party will hand Labour a landslide majority at the next election. Good news for Nigel Farage today. He soared from 3% at the last election to 16%. It's going to be tough for David Cameron, this one, isn't it?
It is. We've had polls before at 15%, so it's 1% up on that. I think kind of two notes of caution, really. UKIP definitely steal more from the Conservatives than from the other parties, but we shouldn't get carried away that all UKIP voters have been stolen from the Tories. They do go from other parties too. The big thing is the final line on the front page there, translated into votes at the next election, it would cost the Tories 51 seats and give Ed Miliband's party a Commons majority of 94. Well, there is no way this will be translated into votes at the next general election. Now, in the European elections, I think it's entirely likely that UKIP will do rather well. Several reasons for that. Low turnout, and the sort of people that will turn out at European elections are people who are cross about Europe, and that's UKIP voters. And also because people know the government doesn't depend on it, so they'll do well in the European election. But in the general election, when no one seriously thinks that Nigel Farage would be in government, and probably wouldn't want that to be the case either, I find it highly doubtful that they will damage the Tories, definitely, but I find it highly doubtful that they'll be getting figures as high as 16%, because they're still a minority party, and minority parties find it, whether that be the Greens or the BNP or UKIP, who are all three very different parties, always find it fantastically difficult under first past the post at general elections. I
would say perhaps the irony in this story is that the UKIP would have benefited massively from David Cameron's very ferocious anti-European stance. And it goes to a rival party. I find it extremely ironical for David Cameron that he should lose votes because of his position on Europe, and it benefits a rival party like UKIP.
Well, that's why the right is going to seize hold of this. I would be very surprised if, coming up to the next general election, David Cameron hasn't promised an in-out referendum, because that would strangle...
He's hinted at it,
He's hinted at it without saying it, and that will just strangle UKIP, really, especially if... as long as he... I mean, I'm not in favour of that, but for that to work, he will have to word it in an absolutely watertight way.
That's the problem with referendums.
That is the problem. Oh, no, I don't mean wording the referendum. I mean wording the promise to have the referendum. Because we all know about specific politicians' promises before elections. We'll think back to the pledges. Well, we'll think back to the pledges that the Lib Dems signed, each individually signed about tuition fees. But I would be very surprised if this surge continues, and I think it will do. I'd be very surprised if the official Tory policy isn't for an in-out referendum. Already, it's becoming a much more mainstream opinion.
Indeed. And it also suggests that parties like the Lib Dems are completely disappearing. I mean, once they are out of the coalition government, I don't think they have much of a future ahead with parties like UKIP, soaring.
Yes. And also, they were traditionally the most European party, and they're kind of rather quiet about that these days.
Let's just take a look at the Observer, because that's just in, and a very menacing picture on the front there. This is from Belfast, the violence that's been continuing now for 3 nights, well, really been continuing for 5 weeks, really, hasn't it?
Well, they stopped for Christmas. They stopped rioting for Christmas.
Yeah, well, it's very, very good of them, wasn't it? But this is all about the flying of the Union flag at City Hall in Belfast, and we've seen the violence continue there today as well. It's going on into this evening. Our correspondents there are saying it's not quite as bad tonight, but there's certainly a lot of riot police on the streets, and there's now one man at least being charged with attempted murder after shots were fired, with accusations that the paramilitaries are getting involved, hijacking all of this. And there's no sign of a resolution, really, is there?
No, unless, I mean, it started as a very political story, in fact, with the Belfast City Council, emitting restrictions on the flying of the Union flag. And it has to be said that, of course, these pictures are very alarming, and the violence is indeed escalating. But there are thousands of people who demonstrated peacefully to make a political point as well. And as usual, it's always a minority of people who manage to hijack political marches.
I don't know. I'm not on the ground. I wonder whether there were that many moderates out on the street in this demonstration. I mean, I think what's interesting is whether the UVF leaders who were released from prison as part of the peace process, the way that the way that the agreement stands is that anyone who causes trouble again, who's involved in paramilitary violence, can be recalled to prison. It'll be interesting. Now, would that inflame the situation, or would that take the ringleaders off the street? I don't know, but it might be what ends up happening. I mean, it's an amazing reminder of what a peculiar part of the United Kingdom Northern Ireland is.
And volatile.
Do you have any idea which flags are flying over your town hall tonight? I have absolutely no idea if there's any flag, if there's no flag at all, if there's the Union flag, the European flag. I don't know if it's Black History Month. There might be a flag, from Jamaica or something. I don't know. I have no idea. More than that, I really don't care.
That's the difference in this part of the world.
This is such an important symbol.
Stay with us. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll take a look at the other main story here on The Observer. It says that soldiers and nurses are going to be hit by benefit curbs. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Welcome back. We're looking through the newspaper front pages as they come on with Vince Graff and Nabila Ramdani. We've just got some latest pictures coming into us from Belfast. Just before the break, we were talking about the violence that's been erupting there over the past few days. 3 nights now of violence in the Newton Ards area. I'm not quite sure where these pictures are coming into us from, but there's been police in riot gear out on the streets for several days now. There was a peaceful protest outside Belfast City Hall. This is all about the raising of a Union flag there on designated days. There was a peaceful protest there, attended by thousands. But tonight there is further violence. There's a fire there going on, as you can see. And clearly, also petrol bombs being thrown at police. We know that one person, a 38-year-old man, has been arrested on suspicion of attempted murder. This is after a gun was fired at police. Thankfully, no one was hurt by that. Police have been injured, but none seriously, thankfully. But there's been a huge amount of unrest and protest there, and another night of violence, as you can see. We'll update you on that throughout the evening, but let's carry on with the papers, though. With Vince and with Nabila, and we were saying just before the break we were going to talk about this story on the front of The Observer. Soldiers and nurses are going to be hit by benefit curbs. It says here that 500,000 soldiers, nurses and teachers will have their income slashed under the coalition's benefits crackdown, according to a new report. Up to 40,000 soldiers, 300,000 nurses and 150,000 primary and nursery school teachers will lose cash. It says in the finer detail, by 2015, a second lieutenant in the army who has 3 children, who earns £470 per week and whose wife does not work, will lose £552 a year. Now, although the figures may not be huge, when you're talking about people like nurses, like teachers, who are not that well paid in the first place, this is going to bite, isn't it?
Yes, very much so. And in the article, there's an interesting detail here where it said that the revelation appears to contradict the government's stated intention to target shirkers and scroungers, and will raise the temperature of the Commons debates and vote on the plan on Tuesday. So clearly the initial target of the government, this plan is not going to affect the people initially targeted by it, but effectively affect people whose, I feel, role and indeed profession is not valued enough, like nurses, teachers, and indeed soldiers who are fighting abroad. And this will be particularly harrowing for those professions specifically.
I think in the same way that the story about the train minister doesn't go to work by train, this is also kind of, you think about it, an obvious story. These are basically low-paid workers who are losing out. I would think mostly this is affected by tax credits. And I guess it's not a surprise that if you're... And in terms of losing out, it's because the increases are capped at 1%. So I presume the money they will lose will be in comparison if they had been pegged to keep up with inflation. I mean, I don't think it's good news, but I don't think it's a surprise. I don't think it's a surprise that the Observer will choose to focus on this and that the Daily Telegraph and the Mail will choose to focus on the fact that wages haven't risen as quickly as benefits have risen. I think it's an interesting illustration of what's happening, but I don't really think it will change any minds, and I don't really think it's the kind of central point about what's going on. OK,
let's have a look at the Sunday Times. That's Justin. Quite a few different stories going on here, but we were just looking in the break at this one. Cover-up hospitals face the axe, talking specifically about the Mid Staffordshire NHS Foundation. There's an inquiry into as many as 1,200 deaths there. This article says that the public inquiry has recommended that NHS hospitals which cover up mistakes and hide harm caused to patients by their doctors and nurses should face fines and possibly even closure.
Well, if they're paying fines or closing down, does that mean they've got less money? If they're paying fines, does that mean they've got less money to treat their patients, which doesn't sound like very good news if that's your local hospital? And if they're closing down, that also doesn't sound like great. Yeah,
this is a problem with any story where a hospital or medical practitioners are punished, because it actually affects us, all the ordinary people in this country who need their services.
I mean, I don't know the details about this story, but perhaps, you know, it takes a closer look at how hospitals are run. If they subcontract nurses or doctors, which is often the case, then, you know, it might deserve a closer look at how they are specifically run, to see what is the problem that allows so many people dying.
That's what the inquiry's, that's what the inquiry's about.
Yes. It seems amazing that it's saying that there'll be a statutory enforceable duty of candour that would threaten NHS hospitals that failed to inform patients when their treatment has gone wrong.
It's astonishing, isn't it, that they don't do so already?
But I would think that it would be a tiny proportion of doctors that wouldn't tell you. I mean, that's the other thing. I don't think we should look at what happened at the Mid Staffordshire Hospital and think that that is a picture of the health service. It's a picture of what happened at that hospital. OK,
we've just got time to have a quick look at the Sunday Telegraph's front page. A picture there of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge looking forward to their first baby, of course. And apparently they're going to get a new home, a Georgian home in Norfolk as their country residence. Just have a quick look here. Anything that you particularly appeal to you? Oh, this is the interview with the Prime Minister. He wants to lead the country until at least 2020. So bad news for anybody that wanted to replace him as the Tory party leader anytime soon. But he's kind of, you know, got his flag out, you know, now, hasn't he? He's saying, right, I'm not going anywhere. This is who I'm about, this is where I'm going, and I'm sticking with it, and you're not kind of getting rid of me.
The reverse, though?
Well, I did think about that.
You know, I'll be here for a couple of years, and I might kind of...
I don't think it's unreasonable to expect from a politician, and indeed a Prime Minister, to be ambitious and not to be a one-term Prime Minister, especially if you want to implement reforms that usually take a long time, you know, to implement and indeed get results while you're in office.
But this only means that he'll stand in 2015 and say he'll serve a full term, and there is I can't think of a political leader that has stood and said, I'm doing this as a kind of temporary fill-in job before I go and write my memoirs.
Right. And earn lots of money. OK, there we must leave it. Vince, Nabila, thanks very much for taking us through those Sunday front pages in so far. Don't forget, there's plenty more front pages in Sky News at 10. Plus our full press preview at 11:30, when we'll look inside tomorrow's newspapers with The Guardian's Julie Bindel and TVC Group's commercial director Adam Klein. So do stay with us for that. Now, though, let's take a look at tomorrow's weather.